convene the meeting with a welcome and introductions. So I guess at the lieu of introductions, I suppose we should just go ahead and announce who's here from the board, and if anything else additional we can do if someone wants.
I can do that. Brenda here has been tracking those people that we are aware of, so I think she's going to do that.
Oh, great.
So we have 10 people on the phone whose names are not showing up. So I'm just going to read off who I can see on the board, and then I will move to the callers that are on the phone. So we have Drew Pfefferly, Sid Schoaf, Neil Moyer, Lucy Vinnis, Kelly Clark, Carl Ye, Ray Smith, Aurora Jackson. Let me mark that off here. AJ Jackson, Molly Carey, Rob Innerfeld, Joe Burney, Rebecca Lewis, Sasha Vartanian, Rachel Dorfman, Bill Johnston, Dan Collister, Ellen Courier, Ann Heath, Andrew Martin, Emma Newman, Tom Boyott, Betty Taylor, Joe Pictionary, and then we have callers on the phone. So if I have not called your name, could you let me know what your name is?
Pete Sorensen.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
I'm Corey Parrish.
Corey Parrish.
Yep. Claire Ross.
Claire Ross.
Ross.
Okay. Anyone else?
I can tell you that Councillor Sean Van Gordon is trying to get in on the meeting, but he'll be here shortly.
Okay, thank you. Oh, you are great.
Matt
Thank
McRae
you.
participates by phone.
1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I've got 6 people on.
We're one of the ones on the phone.
Okay.
And then I know Terry Parker also identified as being on the phone. Is there anybody else on the, pardon me?
Kelsey's Lavore.
Kelsey Zavlor?
Yep.
Thank you.
Matt McRae participating by phone. I'm not sure if you caught mine.
Great. Thank you. Got one person on the phone that has not identified themselves.
Are any of the people that are visible to us also using their phone to call in?
No? Okay, well, I say we just get started.
Counselor, thank you. I believe that is our introductions, and we do again have a quorum.
Great, thank you, Paul. So let's go ahead and, I've called a meeting to order. Of course, we did the introduction. I guess I can call a meeting to order. And I'm looking for an approval of the September 3rd MPC meeting minutes.
So moved.
This is Carl Ye. I'll second it. Carl Ye.
So I have a moved and seconded. Did you catch who?
Who's the second? I'm sorry. Thank you.
Oh, I seconded. This is Carl Ye with LTD seconds.
And I did not observe my name when I firsted, or whatever you call it, made the motion. This is Joe Burney.
Oh, we see you, Joe. Okay. It's been moved and seconded, and all in favor signify. Do you want to do a call by name, or do you want to just go a signify by yay and a signification of nay? Do you want to do it that way, Brenda or Paul?
Yes, please.
So all's in favor, please signify by yay.
Yay.
Aye.
Any opposed, signify same. None opposed, appears to carry unanimously. Thank you. So is there any adjustments to the agenda or announcements from the MPC members?
Counselor, if I may, I just want to make sure everybody is aware of the revised agenda I sent out last night. If not, I'll just mention real quick that changes the order of what was items B and C, so that we're now having the ODOT presentation as B and the RTP goals discussion as item C.
Thank you, Paul. And I did see a hand up by Carl Ye.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to mention that Caitlin Vargas, who is on the LTD board, will be my counterpart joining us at MPC just for at a future meeting.
Great. Thank you and welcome, Caitlin. Anything else from MPC members? Okay, great. Moving on. So I understand we do have some comments from the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and let Paul or Brenda take the list from there. And basically anyone wishing to make the comment is again, obviously asked to sign up, and you'll be provided 3 minutes per person. And take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Counselor. So far, I have had 4 people notify me that they wish to speak during this section of the agenda. So we will start with those, and I'll call them in the order that they contacted me. So first up, please, would be Matt McRae.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Hello, MPC members. My name is Matt McRae. I live here in Eugene. Thank you for taking the time to hear public testimony during this meeting. As you begin initial stages of updating the Regional Transportation Plan, I hope you will incorporate an explicit goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This plan should reflect the values of the residents in our region, the vast majority of whom understand the risks posed by climate change and understand our transportation system needs to change in order to reduce emissions. According to the most recent survey done by Yale, this was done in 2020, and I will send you a link in an email today, 63% of adults in Lane County are worried about global warming, and 54% of adults in Lane County agree that, quote, local officials should do more to address global warming, end quote. This long-term regional transportation plan sets the stage for millions of dollars of transportation investments that will last for decades. So it's important that these long-term community investments reflect both the realities of today and our goals for tomorrow. I hope you'll take this opportunity to confidently incorporate the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions within an updated RTP. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Next up is Claire Roth.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, hello MPC. My name is Claire Roth. Thank you for all of the hard work you've put into developing the 2045 Regional Transportation Plan thus far. I am here virtually today to ask that you add a specific goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the aforementioned plan. Our world is way past due for the kind of climate attention it deserves, seeing as there is no planet B. Transportation accounts for about 28% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, the biggest slice of the greenhouse gas pie, which personally doesn't sound like an appetizing dish. Talking about transportation without talking about greenhouse gas emissions is like trying to drive a car without wheels. It's an incomplete concept and won't get you where you need to go. Unfortunately, in many respects, it's too late to reverse the devastating effects climate change has already brought upon this earth. It's no longer a question of what we will lose, but a question of how much more we will lose, unless we stand up and make goals, which later blossom into commitments and standing change. A healthy, sustainable, and prosperous future is possible, but it won't be easy. Adding a tangible goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions into the 2045 Regional Transportation Plan is a step in the right direction of this better future, if but a small one. We can do this, we must do this, and the time is now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Claire. Next up is Kelsey Zlor.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Hi, thank you for your time today. My name is Kelsey Zlor, and I'm the former chair of the City of Eugene Sustainability Commission. As a planner with an environmental science background, it is imperative that the 2045 Regional Transportation Plan includes a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I spent part of my time 2 weekends ago knocking on doors of the Graduate Hotel, delivering meals to environmental refugees displaced by the recent wildfires. These fires were in part fueled by climate change, which is directly tied to our greenhouse gas emissions. To not include a goal or vision for reducing our greenhouse gases through our transportation planning, to me, quite frankly, feels disrespectful to these refugees, our wildfire crisis, and the young adults of the future who will continue to be impacted by our lack of action, including people like myself. I strongly encourage including a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the 2045 Regional Transportation Plan, and know many other young people will be looking for you to do so as well. Thank you so much for your time and work on this effort.
Thank you, Kelsey. The last person that's informed me ahead of time that they would like to speak is Terry Parker.
Hello, how's my sound?
It's good, Terry.
Great, thanks. My name is Terry Parker. I live in Eugene, and my comments today are as a representative of 350 Eugene. Full disclosure, I also volunteer with the Better Eugene Springfield Transportation Best and with the League of Women Voters of Lane County, but I'm not speaking for those organizations. I'd like to encourage the MPC to fully acknowledge the climate crisis and the significant role that transportation planning and policy changes can make in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Please adopt greenhouse gas emission goals and objectives that support and align with other local plans, such as the City of Eugene, LTD, the Developing Plan of Lane County, as well as the Governor's Executive Order. We all need to work together to make these significant changes. It seems to me that you have an obligation to apply and use the lens of both climate change and social equity in the important work that you do. To do less is just not acceptable in these times. Thank you for your good work. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Terry. And then I will ask if there is anybody else in the meeting that would like to offer comments from the audience.
Yes, I would. My name is Corey Parrish, and first off, I'll apologize for not signing up beforehand. This is my first time giving public comment in a virtual setting, and this is a learning environment for all of us, so thank you for being flexible with allowing people to speak. I am calling today to ask the MPC to consider adding an explicit goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the 2045 Regional Transportation Plan being developed. Without having an explicit climate change goal, you can't achieve the other two goals that you already have listed in your plan, which I reviewed. The first is an integrated transit and land use system, and transportation now is the #1 polluter in greenhouse gas emissions. So without addressing the fact that our transportation system is adding the most in our climate change worries, that it's going to be very hard to achieve that goal. And then also your second goal is sustainability in transportation, and sustainability is built on the premise of climate change. So if you don't add a goal for specific greenhouse gas emissions decrease, you can't really achieve sustainability. Also, without addressing explicit goals for climate change, you are already failing to support other objectives listed in the Regional Transportation Plan, specifically Objective 4, which is an environmental commitment, Objective 5, which is economic vitality. We know that communities that have strong climate change and sustainability practices are more economically stronger than other communities, so it's a matter of competitiveness. And then lastly, you are also failing to already meet Objectives 6 and 7, which is equity and public health. We know, for instance, that transportation affects air quality, and as you can see outside today, the air quality isn't the best, and that's due to the wildfires recently. Many Lane County residents who lost their homes and have been displaced otherwise, but also air quality effects in just normal day-to-day operations. We know that low-income communities and communities of color tend to be along major highways, which impacts their air quality. And without addressing a specific goal to decrease the greenhouse gas emission, you're failing these communities too. And also lastly, I am someone who just graduated from the University of Oregon with a transportation planning degree. But I'm also looking to build my career and start a family here. And I feel that I'm speaking to the generations ahead of me, as well as you two, that we need to start taking climate change much more seriously and much more forcefully. And this would also support other climate action plans here in Lane County, such as the City of Eugene Climate Action Plan 2.0, the LTD Climate Action Policy, and then ODOT's Oregon for Every Mile Counts program. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Anybody else wishing to speak? Counselor, I don't see any indication.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate that. And thank you for the folks that have spoke with us. I appreciate it. So next on the agenda is the Metropolitan, the MPO issues, beginning with 6A, University of Oregon Travel Survey. Paul, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Lewis from the University of Oregon. She is sharing her screen right now and will be giving a presentation, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me today to share results of an ongoing research project. So I'm part of a team at the U of O who has received an interdisciplinary grant from the university to study what was going to be the Smart Trips program in Eugene. And we quickly pivoted when the pandemic happened to study what's going on with transportation and the region as a result of COVID-19. So our team is very interdisciplinary. You see the long list there of people in marketing and psychology and planning and business, and we're trying to approach this from a really diverse disciplinary perspective. So we took the opportunity. Can you hear me okay? Okay, just.
You dropped out for a moment, Rebecca, but now I think you're back.
Okay, great. So the purpose of our study was trying to understand how people were moving before COVID, both for commute trips and grocery trips, as well as recreational trips, how they changed their behavior when the stay-at-home orders went into effect. We also asked a lot of questions about how accessible and safe their neighborhoods felt for biking and walking. And we asked some questions about their support for various transportation and environmental policies, and looked at some demographics. So we administered our survey online, given, again, the pandemic, but we were pretty happy with our response rate using social media pages, email lists, and social media advertising. And I'll share with you on the next couple of slides the representativeness of our sample. We also have followed up our survey with some interviews and focus groups, and so I'll share some of the key findings from those as well. But we really took this as a chance to try to understand what was going on with transportation behavior and how people were maybe using the transportation systems differently than before. So in terms of our survey response rates, in terms of gender, we had a sort of overrepresentation of female respondents, but we had a fairly good representation on race and ethnicity compared to the region. In terms of age, we had a fairly good representation for most groups, but a fairly poor representation of the 18 to 24 group, despite some attempts at targeted advertising on different platforms. And we had fairly good representation by income. So with this demographic information, we have a pretty good sense that we're talking to a sort of diverse group of people in the Eugene area, Eugene Springfield area, I should say. And I'll show you on the next slide where our responses came from on a zip code map. So we have, I know you can't see the labels there very well, but you can see the darkness of the colors and see where most of our responses were coming from. We have an overrepresentation of the 97405 South Eugene zip code, a little bit of underrepresentation in Santa Clara and Thurston, but fairly, I have another slide that I'm hiding that shows the percentage of population versus responses, fairly well distributed across the region as well. We have a few responses from outside Eugene Springfield, but our target was really focused on these two largest cities within the region. So I'm going to shift to the transportation side of things, and mostly what I'm going to show you is before and after. So what were people doing before COVID and how did they change their behavior after? This first graphic shows how people in our region get to work. in terms of their predominant mode of travel. The next slide is going to show you how our survey respondents get to work. So about 70% of people in the region drive alone to get to work. And the ones to pay attention to that'll be a little different from the next slide are this drive alone and bike and transit share. So this is the region as a whole. This next slide is showing our survey respondents. So we have an overrepresentation of bicyclists, overrepresentation of transit riders and walkers. Our theory about this, while we did use some of the listservs from local bike groups, we also used Facebook advertising broadly. Our theory is that people who bike like to talk a lot about transportation, and so they were willing to share their perspectives. But this is just something to keep in mind as you see the results through the next several slides. In terms of, oops, sorry, I skipped one. Work status, we asked people what they were doing for work during and after and what changes they had. Most people were working outside of the home. And these numbers are fairly on track with what our region looks like as a whole. So 60% of Eugene Springfield is employed and 65% of our respondents are employed. So we weren't overrepresenting retirees or people that weren't working in our survey. Within the work status during, we heard from a few people that they had some changes in jobs, and there was a big uptick in people working from home when they used to go to an office. So working their same job, but now working from their place of residence. This is, of course, is going to impact travel patterns, as I'll come to in the next few slides. So we asked about, as I said, a lot of transportation surveys and a lot of the data that we have ready access to through American Community Survey and other things focus explicitly on commute trips. We also wanted to know how people were using the transportation system for recreation. So we asked about how much they were walking or running or jogging around their neighborhood before. And then we asked about how they were doing that during COVID. We specifically asked about a typical week during COVID and then their overall practices beforehand. So what was interesting in these results was we expected that people were walking more around their neighborhoods during, and we do see, some people were walking just a little bit and now they're walking a few times more, but we also see some people who just stop walking entirely in their neighborhoods. And I tried to do a little bit of digging to try to understand who those population is, to see if it's sort of people that are on the older side of the age spectrum. But this is something we need to dig into deeper to try to understand. With cycling, we saw some drop off here as well. We do see some people using cycling sort of a little bit more frequently than they were before, but also sort of compared to before COVID, using cycling a little bit less as well. We asked specifically about functional trips. So this means getting to work, going to grocery, doing things that are sort of necessary as opposed to recreational activities or social activities. And we asked around beforehand and during COVID how they were using different modes of transportation. So the things to pay attention to here are some big jumps here in things like carpooling and ride-hailing, going to never using these. And you're going to see this reflected on the next slide that focuses on non-auto modes. But some of the big changes that were happening here were that people stopped using modes of transportation where they would be interacting with other people. Makes a lot of sense given the type of situation that we're in, but it was interesting to see this really clearly reflected in the data. We also, what you don't see is a huge jump in people taking a lot more single occupancy motor trips. They're actually using the transportation system less, predominantly because a lot of them are working from home. But you don't see this sort of like wholesale one-for-one trade of going from using these other modes to just relying on cars instead. The situation with transit and biking and walking is fairly interesting as well. There's a big jump of people who were using transit somewhat infrequently, who've stopped using it entirely. But I want to point out that there's still people that are using transit every day. are using it several times a week. So our transit system is still really important to people getting around. And I'll talk more about that in some of our qualitative results as well. With biking, we see a little bit sort of less behavior, but what you're seeing there is some sort of like shifting to doing it a little bit more frequently than they were before. Less use of bike share going on as well, which goes with sort of the patterns that we saw. But what we see is some shifting to walking more for functional trips instead of using some of these other modes. So these results, while sort of in line with our expectations on sharing, also were really interesting to us in terms of understanding how people have shifted. One of the other things we asked about was grocery. So how are you getting to grocery beforehand, and how are you getting to grocery during COVID? So we were particularly interested in whether there'd been a big shift to using online delivery or using store pickup. And I have another slide that will talk a little bit more specifically about that. But this was really interesting to us. The big shift that's happening here is that people are starting to rely on online delivery more than driving alone, more than biking, more than transit to get their groceries. So you are seeing that shift into using online delivery. But again, you're not seeing a big jump in people driving alone. In some of the open-ended responses, we heard a lot about people provisioning for themselves or provisioning for others as well while they're doing grocery trips. We also heard a lot about people shopping as much for not shopping as frequently for the number of trips that they had, so that they're doing bigger trips less frequently instead. So in terms of the method, most people are still going to the store and doing the shopping themselves, but there has been this increase in online ordering, phone ordering, and store pickup. So this is a big change from before. And you saw that from the last slide, that it was a really small share of Eugene Springfield residents that were doing that, and now there's this big increase. Another thing we were curious about was whether people were starting to just approach how they go out and about differently. So were they starting to combine trips more than they did before, what we call in transportation trip chaining. So we saw a lot of people say that they were doing more trip chaining. A lot of people saying they were doing about the same, and a few that were doing less of this. And so this was somewhat interesting in terms of thinking about how people piece together their transportation patterns. The next series of slides here, and these are some maps I know that will be difficult to sort of, again, see the numbers and see the zip codes, but hopefully you can see the sort of darkness of the green here. So we asked the residents to evaluate whether they thought their neighborhood was accessible to basic goods like groceries and to outdoor facilities like parks through biking and walking. So the first one here is showing walking accessibility. And when I did this presentation to the task, I showed this just sort of in an aggregate scale, but I wanted to show you the geographic information. So it's really interesting. You see a pretty big divide along the river, where people on the south side of the river see things as more walkable than the north side of the river. And you sort of see this divide between downtown Springfield and Thurston a little bit as well. And this will come up in the biking too. But we were kind of surprised to see 97405 South Eugene as being perceived as so walkable. And one of the issues here is that the zip codes are so large. So in some of our next phases of analysis, we'll be narrowing this information down to smaller units of geography like census tracts. But this gives you a sense for what people are seeing. And the one big takeaway I want to share is that on the whole, people saw their neighborhoods as very accessible in walking and biking to these basic needs. The average scores were very high overall. So then on the biking accessibility from residents, you see some differences here. You see downtown Eugene and downtown Springfield as being seen as the most bikeable, while the 97402, 97405 are just a little bit less, seen as a little bit less bikeable, but fairly interesting results here. And I think on the whole, feeling like people think that their neighborhoods are accessible. We also asked about whether they thought their neighborhoods were safe places to bike and walk, and whether their layouts supported biking and walking. And again, on the whole, people thought that their neighborhoods were safe places for biking and walking, and generally thought that their neighborhoods supported. So you see more on the right-hand side here, people agreeing with that. So the next couple of sets of slides get at policy and what we sort of use this as a crosswalk to understand who we're talking to in terms of people. So we're asking about their beliefs about various sort of policy approaches. And then the next slide, we're asking about, given the changes in the transportation patterns, how does that change your support for different policies? So here we see that our respondents think that driving less is good for the environment. They think that air quality has improved because of the pandemic, which now is like, we did the survey in July before the wildfires. If we did the survey now, you'd probably see different results. But then we also see some interesting results here around policy tolerance and what people were interested in. The one that kind of surprised me was that we asked whether they believed that residents in their community cared more about the environment than the economy. And that was actually our lowest score. So the perception being that people think that their community sees the economy as more important than the environment. The next one here is this. So this was sort of set up in a way to say, okay, air quality has gotten a lot better in a lot of cities during the pandemic. Given that air quality has improved so much, would you be more likely to support, has your tolerance for different practices to reduce driving been strengthened? And so we're asking kind of as, did your policy perception change during the pandemic because of what you saw happening? And we see the sort of most common or largest group here is it did increase. People were more likely to support these policies after, which was pretty interesting to us. The last couple I'm going to share with you here are, again, opinions here about what people thought is going to happen in the future. So what do you, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Could you go back a slide?
Yes.
So when did you show them what our actual LRAPA improvement in air quality was? Right, the air quality regionally is so good. So is it possible that they feel this way and that our air quality is perceived as getting better, but may not have been marginally better?
No, that's a great question. So the way we worded the question was more broad. We didn't use local data. So I'm reading the text of the question. Given that US cities have seen improvements in air quality during stay-at-home orders, to what extent has your support for policies that would reduce driving, example, telecommuting, increased transportation, or increased public transportation fees or bicycle infrastructure been strengthened? So we didn't use local data. We sort of relied on the national, the pictures of LA that people were seeing, the pictures of Atlanta, these cities that were usually really small. Yeah, good question.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, no problem. Yes.
And I'm sorry to, beat this up, but so this really isn't a local picture on this slide. It's not Eugene Springfield.
It is Eugene Springfield, and it is asking residents about their tolerance for policies, but it's in the context of what they're seeing happening nationally. We didn't say, do you support the city of Eugene putting into place policy? We were intentionally were somewhat broad because we didn't want to put the word taxes in a word and then them automatically dismiss everything. So I'll say this isn't a super nuanced approach to understanding this, but we were asking only residents of the Eugene Springfield region what they thought about this, but it's not specific to data based on Eugene and Springfield, if that makes sense.
Right.
Or specific examples about policies.
So in fact, our air quality in this area could have actually worsened during this time, but they're getting the kind of a misnomer that's saying, oh, by the way, because of COVID, air quality is getting better. But in fact, locally, it could have gotten worse based on outside influences, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, we were the survey went out in July, so it was before wildfire smoke. And it was before a lot of the stay-at-home orders had expired. And so it was a period of time where travel had declined a lot. And our purpose here was more focused on, are people seeing the connection between air quality and driving, which is what we asked on the last slide? Are they seeing that there's been an improvement in air quality because people are driving less on a national scale? Again, knowing that our local picture is different. We're not an attainment area. We have a completely different situation in Eugene in terms of the sources of our air pollution. But given that, they've seen this connection on the ground, that we had this natural experiment for them to see it, has that changed their tolerance for wanting to put into place policies? So to me, what it's getting at is, do people value this sort of improvement in air quality at a national scale so much that they're willing to change their policy support to support policies that they might not have supported in the past, is the way that I read this.
Thank you.
Yes. Great questions. Thank you.
If I may.
Yes.
I think the moral of the story on this discussion is that data doesn't interpret itself. It has to be it has to be interpreted. So the question, I'm going to save my questions for the end, but I think that's really critical to understand. Who is interpreting the data and what is the agenda attached to that interpretation?
Thank you. So the next set was asking people about what they think others will be doing in the future. So it's not about their own individual behavior, but it's around, do you think people will be more likely to use these different modes of transportation after the pandemic? And we're sort of open-ended about that because who knows when that will be. But we use this as sort of a chance to understand where they thought behavior would go in the future. And so what you see here is fairly similar to what people's own behavior was, that they think people will be carpooling and using transit less than before. But to me, what was really stunning about this is they don't see that shifting all to driving. So they don't see that people are going to stop riding buses and they're going to start driving everywhere. The biggest shares of increase here are actually in biking and walking. So they think that people will shift to biking and walking. I think that's unique to our region because of the infrastructure we have and the sort of community that we have compared to other places where you have seen this more direct shift from transit to driving alone. But this was pretty interesting and I think again goes with what you would expect in terms of a pandemic like this. We didn't want to make this survey only about telecommuting because there were a lot of national surveys going on at the time that were really digging deep into telecommuting. But we wanted to know whether people thought that they would be more likely to telecommute in the future. When I presented this to the task, this was one that we kind of tossed around and talked about quite a bit because some of these were a little surprising, particularly the line there around, I would like to work from home, but my employer may not allow it. So I dug a little deeper into the data, and the ones that are saying working at home is not relevant to my job are people working in healthcare, or people working in retail, or working in food and beverage. And the ones that were falling into the I would like to work from home, but my employer may not allow it, the two biggest categories there were education and public administration, actually. So my sector and many of your sectors. And so that to me was fairly interesting as well. Although, with education, if you have students in a classroom, this becomes somewhere that isn't quite as easy. Many public administration jobs can be done remotely as well. So this was kind of interesting from a sort of policy perspective, transportation options perspective as well. The last two slides I'm going to close with before opening it up for questions. So as I mentioned, we did several interviews and focus groups. And for today, I'm just sharing the key themes. And to the question that Joe asked a few minutes ago, I want to note that this is really preliminary results. So we finished the survey, I have descriptive data, but we're doing a whole lot more cleanup and cross tabulations and regression analysis to really understand what's going on here. We also have a lot more cleanup to do on our interviews and focus group transcripts, but we did 6 focus groups and we did about, I think, 10 interviews, both in English and Spanish. And we are starting to sort of understand the key themes that came out of there, because these interviews and focus groups really help us interpret the data better of what's going on. So we saw people shifting their recreational trips where they're doing a lot more in their neighborhoods. So to me, I see this sort of 20-minute neighborhood being such an important concept for people during this pandemic. We saw more trip chaining. We saw modal shifts, so driving less, walking more, using transit a lot less. Different sort of levels of comfort with using things like rideshare or using transit. And then we saw people sort of talking a lot about feeling more connected to their neighborhood in a way that they hadn't before. And then there were sort of some findings around employers shifting their support for work at home, where their employers never allowed work from home before. Now they saw that it worked okay, and so they were hoping to get to work from home more in the future. So a couple of quotes I wanted to share with you from these interviews, and just to pull out a couple things. Someone realizing that they used to drive all around, they live in South Eugene, they used to go to Costco all the time, and they realized that they can get all their needs and see everyone they need to see and do everything within their neighborhood, which was really interesting. So they shifted their behaviors a lot in terms of how they're provisioning and how they're recreating and how they're seeing friends. And then the other one on the right-hand side gets at transit, because that's something we heard about a lot. We did a focus group that was only people that are transit riders. So we set our focus groups up to be modally specific to try to dig deep into different modes of transportation. And it was really fascinating to hear the people that are reliant on transit, who have no other option, versus pretty much everyone else who used to ride transit who has now stopped. And so this is an example of a quote from someone who said they don't use transit anymore. They're shifting to using their bicycle because they don't feel safe being around other people. And so, but what to me was sort of interesting was hearing those in the focus group who were relying on transit and what that meant for them. So I want to close with some key takeaways. As to be expected, we saw a lot of shifts in commuting behavior and grocery shopping and in recreational trips. We saw decreased interest in modes of transportation that rely on sharing and interacting with others, but increased interest in biking and walking. There's mixed perceptions about working from home after COVID. It's not sort of as clear cut, mostly because of the job sector that people are in. But there is an opportunity to try to encourage employers to allow for telework when feasible with the jobs, given some of the experiences and what we've seen here. People see their neighborhoods as accessible and safe for biking and walking, but they see biking and walking as such an important part of the future that this becomes a really important part of the transportation story from my interpretation of this data. And then finally, this goes back to the conversation we were having a few moments ago. They illustrate a tolerance and acceptance for environmental policy to reduce driving and improve air quality, with the caveat here that we're really talking about sort of what we saw on the national scale as that translates to tolerance for transportation policies. So thank you for the chance to present. I've got some time that I can take questions, if that sounds good.
Is there any questions from the board? I got one. I see Carl. Go ahead, Carl.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And thank you, Dr. Lewis, for your presentation. I wanted to ask, did you have any predictions as to whether some of these behaviors would still continue after the COVID crisis has subsided, or maybe even over?
That's a great question. We've talked about whether we do a follow-up survey either now or into the future. I think that what we've heard sort of from the focus groups and the more qualitative data is that people have really shifted their routines in a way that they don't see themselves sort of going back to these patterns that they had before. They're settled into new routines that are completely different than what they had before. I think that what was really tough for people when we asked in focus groups around, what are they looking forward to after, what do they see going back to or never going back to, I think it's really hard for people to visualize that. And so even when we're asking this modal question that I'll go back to, it's people's perceptions. We don't know that this is going to be what happens, but this is what people saw. Sorry, I lost it. Oops.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, that's, yeah.
Thank you, Carl. And I see Joe.
The other Joe from Springfield. Thank you, Chair. This is going to sound more critical than it should. I'm trying to say it in the right way, though. A couple of points. When I saw all the key takeaways, my feeling is one doesn't need to conduct a survey to figure out that these are probably logical takeaways from the circumstances we're dealing with. When I was 46 years ago, when I was going to college 46 years ago, my grandfather, who was one of them, who was a bootlegger during the Prohibition, would always look at me and say, "What are you doing up there, Junior, learning how to be stupid?" Here's what I would do. I know I'm in the minority here and I'm just speaking for myself, but if you would go to the slide, I think it was one of your first slides that showed the distribution of transportation systems used by people in Lane County. It had 4% of it. I'm sorry. It had 4%.
It's a little touchy. It's going there, but it takes a minute.
No, that's fine. I'll cover for you. It had 4% of the population using public transportation, which to me is mind-boggling. Pardon me?
Just to get to work, just as a commute trip.
Right. To me, that's mind-boggling. If I was a professor, I would want to say, okay, class, let's take each one of these areas. What is the carbon footprint per user, as well as in the aggregate of each of these areas? How do they compare and contrast? And what specific proposals do we have? Because this is something that is a time for action. Do we have proposed to groups to incorporate in their plans to lower that carbon footprint? I'm not suggesting I know a quarter as much as you, but I am saying something that leads more to proposals for action as opposed to analysis of how people are feeling, I think would be of great utility at this moment in our society.
Thank you for that. I sort of understand where you're coming from, and I've done sort of other work that sort of goes in that direction. This particular survey, we're really trying to dig into the sort of underlying psychology and reasons for why people are doing what they're doing. And so the other people on my team are psychologists and marketing professors who are trying to understand sort of the human side of this and why people are making these decisions. So I hear you around sort of future steps, but our focus here was really trying to take this moment and understand how people were changing their behaviors so we can understand how this might change things in the future. And as I mentioned, this is really preliminary. We'll have more interesting, nuanced results that are sort of more broken down by demography, that are more rigorous. This is really just the descriptive data.
Okay,
that we
do me a favor, if you would be so kind. And when you provide your further, more refined data, identify for us between now and then how many carbon emissions have been emitted.
That's beyond the scope of our research. I'm sorry, that's not something I can do for you. That's beyond the scope of our research, but that's something that's
someone else can do. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Mayor Bennis, go ahead. I have you in queue.
Thank you so much. Rebecca, I just really want to thank you for this research. I think it's incredibly timely for us. And I think it seems to me that one of our challenges, I mean, we're going to be having this conversation just later in this meeting. One of our challenges is, how do we envision not the community that we have, but the community that we want and need for the future? And how do we get ourselves into a place where we can envision that? And part of it is recognizing the opportunity. And COVID, for all the devastation it has wrought, has also brought us this opportunity to re-envision what our neighborhoods feel like when there aren't so many cars, and when kids are able to sort of, in my neighborhood, they're playing in the streets all summer long. Envision what our working lives might be like if we weren't just racing from home to work and back and the grocery. We have an opportunity. So I I do think this is incredibly valuable because I think you're calculating the behavior change, but you're also kind of opening us to that conversation of, how do we actually envision making this step into the communities that we really want to build for the future, and not just assume that we're constantly going to build exactly the same road systems, exactly the same kind of transit systems, right? That we will re-envision that. And so I thank you for this, because I think it's just an excellent step, and it does integrate very well the conversation we're about to have in a few minutes. So wonderful research, and tying in with other research around the barriers that people feel around getting out of their cars. This just is incredibly helpful to see. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary Venice.
Thank you, Mayor. Is there anyone else from this body that would like to ask Rebecca a question? Okay, and I just have a quick one if I can. Rebecca, could you go to slide, I believe, 22?
Yes. Let me try to do this a different way. Sorry,
No, it's all right.
Kind of has a mind of its own, so.
It is what it is. No big deal.
There we go. There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
So I aired try 21.
Yes. Oh, nope, that's too far. Is it the maps?
Did you delete that already? No.
No? What were you thinking of?
Oh, there's some questions answered as regards to how driving habits affected folks locally and how it would impact them in the future, and it didn't. Oh, yeah.
This one?
No. Okay. I guess it's maybe if you could at some point send it to.
Of course, yeah. I can send it
to me, or if we can get that, and I'm going to move on with the meeting. We're kind of running a little bit behind.
Okay.
So if there's no more questions from this body, I'm going to go move to the next subject. Thank you again, Rebecca.
Yes, thank you for the time and the conversation. I appreciate the questions and the chance to share this with you.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Bye.
Okay.
Thanks.
So moving on to item 6B, that was 6C on the agenda. 6B is now Oregon Department of ODOT Climate Office and Every Mile Counts program. Paul, please take it away.
Thank you, Councillor. Amanda Peets, the Director of ODOT's Climate Office, has joined us, and I believe I have made her the presenter, and she has a slideshow, so I would like to turn it over to her. Amanda, if you're ready.
Great, thanks, Paul. My name's Amanda Peets. I am the Director of ODOT's Climate Office. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, Amanda.
Great.
Yes.
Excellent. So a pleasure to be here with you today. So what I'm going to go over is a little bit of what is the Climate Office, what is it about, and then talk about some things that I think might be of interest in particular to the organization. So let's see, I'm going to move this over to the screen, hopefully. Here. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to navigate with this. Can you still see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Let me turn on the camera. Okay, so I was fun with navigating through technical difficulties here. Okay. My apologies. So what I'm here to talk about today is, again, the ODOT Climate Office, kind of why we were formed and what we're about, some of the things that we're working on. So the Climate Office was formed in recognition that we're seeing real and dramatic impacts to the transportation system and elsewhere from changes to the climate. So the recent wildfires certainly that we've seen are a big indication of that, that the climate is changing. We're seeing these big and dramatic effects. We've had things like wildfires before and flooding events, but they're becoming more severe and certainly more frequent. And transportation is a contributor to these things. Transportation accounts for nearly 40% of all greenhouse gases in the state, and so it's the highest polluting sector. So for our part in trying to reduce things, we formed the ODOT Climate Office to start to address ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts that the climate is having. So part of that includes adding a greenhouse gas lens to our climate lens to everything that we do, including how we plan, invest, build, manage, maintain our transportation system. When I say a lens, people often ask, what does that mean? So lens is really something specific that means we're going to look at this, we're going to understand from our investment decisions, for example, the impacts the project has on increasing or decreasing emissions, on being able to adapt to, let's say, more flooding that would happen in the state, and weighing that with other factors that we need to balance as we make transportation decisions. So that will be weighed against other safety decisions we might have to make, and really trying to strike that balance. So it's one lens and an important lens, and it's new that we're doing this. As we do this work, we have three main groups within the Climate Office. Mitigation, which is ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. Adaptation, so what I just talked about with wildfires, extreme precipitation, and some of those impacts. And then sustainability. It's a pretty small group right now, so I have about 5.5 people that work for me. I have a half person because I have another person splitting time between a couple of different offices. Eventually, they'll become full-time in the Climate Office. This group is pretty small because the idea is really integrating climate into everything we do. So we're really working with other parts of the department, like our delivery group, to reduce carbon, to change processes within that. So it really is more than just those folks that are listed here on the screen. It's really having those people work with others in the agency to set new processes and new procedures for reducing emissions from transportation. Focusing first on mitigation, so this is the biggest effort within our office, and I think parallels nicely with the presentation that you just heard. We have a big goal ahead of us for the state of Oregon. The goal is to reduce emissions 75% below 1990 levels by the year 2050. That's a lot of numbers to say. We have to have a huge change in how people travel to really make a difference with transportation emissions. We have a roadmap, though, for how we can do that. It's called the Statewide Transportation Strategy. That was completed back in 2013, so it's been around for quite a few years. We recently looked at it again and validated that those are the right things to do. What we found in that effort is there's no one solution to reducing emissions. Some people think that if we just rely on technology, that will get us to our goals. It's a big portion of it, about half of what we need to do. But the other half is made up of some substantial investments in public transportation and biking and walking, and how we create our land uses, and a number of other factors. So in 2018, like I said, we looked at the statewide strategy again and said, okay, is this the right path? Yes, it is. How are we doing on course with that path? And what we found is we're not. We've actually increased emissions in recent years, although long-term, because of some of the good plans and land use policies that are in existence, that's expected to reduce, but there's a significant gap between where we are and where we want to be. Part of closing that gap comes from the governor's executive order that was came out in March of this year. It's Executive Order 2004, and it's really focused on climate. What that executive order does is it specifies actions for ODOT, for our Department of Transportation, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, some very specific things that we do, and an overall charge to ODOT and all the other state agencies listed within to integrate climate into everything that those agencies do. The other part of the directive in the executive order was around implementing the STS. So it's an affirmation that the STS is Oregon's roadmap for carbon reduction. And it required that 4 state agencies, ODOT, Department of Land Conservation and Development, Department of Energy, and Department of Environmental Quality collaborate together to implement the statewide transportation strategy. So the resulting piece of that was an effort called Every Mile Counts. There's a web link at the end of this presentation if you're interested in learning more about that, or you can type in Every Mile Counts, Oregon, and it will pop up within your search browser. The Every Mile Counts effort has 3 main goal areas within it. In addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's reducing vehicle miles traveled per capita, transitioning to cleaner vehicles and fuels, and integrating greenhouse gases into our decisions. So that framework helped to guide what we identified as our near-term actions. So we developed a 2-year work plan for Every Mile Counts, and also developed the memorandum of understanding across the agencies so that this is a long-term commitment, and every 2 years we'll create a new work plan. Throughout Every Mile Counts and in all the climate work that we do within my agency as well, there is a lens of climate justice that we need to be applying. And climate justice is a concept that the people that are likely least responsible for creating the emission problem are likely the most impacted by the pollution itself. And so we need to make sure that we're working with these frontline communities as we pursue our investments, as we start to address climate change, and as we come up with and identify the actions to do that, is consulting with those communities. So communities of color, low-income individuals, tribal organizations, and others. So some of the specific actions, so I mentioned that in the executive order, there are a few specific actions, the Department of Transportation. One of those is around transportation electrification. So the governor's office has asked ODOT to take a lead amongst the agencies in transportation electrification. Transportation electrification, to really make it happen, is a collaboration among not just ODOT and other state agencies, but also utilities, private charging companies, and others. And so ODOT's role in this is really convening those folks, bringing them together, and figuring out how we enable this. So I say transportation electrification, not because I like to say really long words instead of just saying EVs. I say transportation electrification because it's really more than just the vehicles that drive on the road. It's also micromobility options, so electric scooters, electric bikes. It's public transportation vehicles, as well as the larger freight trucks on the road. So the specific requirement in the executive order is doing a infrastructure needs analysis, seeing where we have gaps in infrastructure charging today, and how do we fill those gaps. We will pay particular attention to rural areas of the state where we have what some people call charging deserts, and we will pay attention to equity concerns. So, for example, many folks that live in multi-unit dwellings, like an apartment complex, don't have access to charging within the parking lots there. So understanding what the opportunities and barriers are to charging there to provide at least a minimum level or secure level of charging that can be relied upon will be key as we think about the needs of all users and being able to access the system. Infrastructure, the charging stations themselves, is only one piece of the pie as we talk about transportation electrification. Obviously, trying to address the barriers to purchasing electric vehicles or leasing electric vehicles will be key, and other things as well. So that's one important piece that's in the executive order, but we have a whole large work item planned around electrification. The other specific action, and I'll spend a fair amount of time on this one with this group because I think it does relate certainly to your interest area as you select transportation projects and move those forward, because much of your funding is federal funding. So the requirement in the executive order is to add a greenhouse gas lens to the STIP, which is our Statewide Transportation Improvement Program. That's where we identify all projects that receive federal funding and list those out. And so now we are required to look at each project or bundle of investments to determine if that will result in more or less greenhouse gas emissions, and use that as a piece of information as we make decisions. So at the end of the day, we're still likely to select some projects, a few projects that may increase emissions. So an example of that would be there's a safety issue at an intersection. We need to add a right turn lane to address the safety problem. You're technically adding capacity. It might increase greenhouse gas emissions, but it's still the right answer because there's a safety issue. But as a whole, the goal of this is across all our investments, we're reducing emissions overall. So we need to offset where we do increase from time to time on those few projects, but overall, we need to be pursuing projects that reduce emissions. So what we're doing is kind of a three-phase approach. And the first phase is where within the STIP program, our Transportation Commission identifies how much money it puts within different buckets of funding. So those buckets of funding include things like safety, non-highway, local programs, and enhance. And then they can vary the amount of money they put in each program. And what we want to do is assess how those changes can benefit or change some of the outcome areas that we care about. So this is where we're focused right now because the Transportation Commission is identifying the funding splits for the 24 through 27 STIP. Sounds like it's a long time in the future, but that's the current one that we're on. And what we're doing is we're looking at real data. We're saying for the previous STIP from 21 through 24, how did we actually spend that money? So the commission allocated money in these ways, in these different buckets, and then we selected projects from there. So did each project increase or decrease emissions? And what we are doing is kind of breaking it down by the attribute of a project. So did a project have a multimodal component? Did a bridge project increase capacity or just go within the same footprint? Did that bridge project address a scour issue or something that might be benefiting adaptation? So we broke down projects into a number of different attributes and associated each attribute with positive or negative impacts on key outcome areas that our commission cares about. So congestion relief, multimodal, equity, safety, these are priorities in the Oregon Transportation Commission's strategic action plan that's being developed. So our charge is really just to look at the climate mitigation piece, greenhouse gas emissions, but we know there's trade-offs as money is placed between different categories, and so we're tracking those trade-offs. So we're using real data to populate this baseline, and then we'll be able to see if money goes up or down in the different categories, how that would impact the various outcome areas. We'll also show some key indicators as we do that. Because a consumer report is helpful in comparing across scenarios, but it doesn't necessarily give you the detail to say, well, what does a half full circle really mean? We'll have key indicators like this. So for example, today, with the state's limited funding dedicated to biking and walking, it will take us 150 years to complete the active transportation system. So if we add more money, how fast can we kind of decrease that time frame for completing the system, or does it lengthen the time frame because we're investing less in it? So those are some of the indicators we want to show. So that's around really that first phase. The second phase is we want to influence the types of projects that are selected. So as our regions go out and they identify projects, they identify more projects than they have money for, and then they narrow those down. So in narrowing those down, we want to again turn to those attributes and say, okay, you're picking a mix of projects that have these kind of attributes, it's not going to be great for greenhouse gas emissions, and hopefully come out then with a better mix of projects that optimize reducing carbon emissions. And then in phase 3, it's more of the accounting. We have the full list of projects identified, and then we tell how much greenhouse gas emissions we can expect from that mix of projects. So that's kind of the three-phase approach that we have for identifying this. Right now, we're focused on projects that are within the Transportation Commission's control to say yes or no to. So we aren't looking at the MPO projects right now. Although I think longer term, there is interest in the MPO doing something similar in reporting on the emissions of some of their projects so that we can kind of track progress statewide on emission reduction. Other efforts that we're engaged in, what I'm really trying to center around here is a statewide transportation strategy that I mentioned earlier, which is our roadmap for carbon reduction, and the various things that we know we need to do. So these are the categories: cleaner vehicles and fuels, pricing the transportation system, land use, and so on. So what I wanted to talk about briefly is what's within each of these categories. So we have the electrification work that I talked about. Within the multi-agency work that Every Mile Counts that I spoke of earlier, there's some efforts that the Department of Environmental Quality is leading. One of those is around the Clean Fuels Program, which is set to sunset, so it extends the lifespan of that program. It also potentially opens that program up for credits for broader things that help to support greenhouse gas reduction, really including some of the electric vehicle side of things. The other area that it's looking at, which is a big deal for the statewide transportation strategy, is on the freight side of things. We've found that freight emissions are particularly hard to reduce, mainly because of the types of goods that are shipped in the state and therefore the mode that they have to travel on. So that's driven by private sector. The role that state agencies can play in this is to understand what the potential future is and to help enable that cleaner future. So we're going to look at the different potential fuels, whether that's hydrogen or electric or renewable diesel and some other fuels that are lower carbon, to see what the future may hold and what we might be able to help build out to support that industry. DEQ is also looking at regulations for medium and heavy duty trucks. That really is consistent with where the state of California and Washington and Oregon have signed on to a compact to say that medium and heavy duty emissions need to be reduced. So that's kind of playing on with that work. For pricing the system, ODOT has its Origo program. We're also looking at tolling and congestion pricing within the Portland metropolitan area. So there's a number of things that we're looking at relative to pricing. For system operations, we have a big effort led by DEQ as part of Every Mile Counts on putting in place a statewide trip reduction policy. Those of you that are familiar with Portland Metro's ECO rule, it's basically an expansion of that rule. What a statewide trip reduction policy does is that it requires within certain areas, geographic areas, so likely larger metropolitan areas that have transportation options available, requiring that some of the large employers within those areas do trip reduction programs with their employees. So that might include allowing their employees to telecommute, to shift the time of day that they are working, and then shift people off peak hours of travel. It could include buying bus passes for employees and some of those kinds of programs. So that's the one that DEQ is leading as part of Every Mile Counts. I heard a little bit of mention during Rebecca's conversation on telecommuting, and that's something we want to leverage where we are today. So COVID is showing many major employers that telecommuting is a viable option and really has shown that proof of concept. Post-COVID, we are hoping not to see a large rebound effect where everybody's going back to work and we're seeing a huge volume increase in traffic again. So how do we support businesses to continue these telecommuting practices to capture some of the benefits in terms of cost savings or recruitment and retention of telecommuting in order to make that business case to sustain that longer term? So that's on the table as well. Transportation options. A lot of the work we're doing around this right now is really kind of tied into the STIP work that I mentioned earlier, really focusing on lower carbon investments. And so potentially as the Transportation Commission considers where to put most of its money, if it increases active transportation spending, there's more of an opportunity, for example, to make strategic investments in biking and walking. Right now, a lot of our investments are opportunistic. We have another project going on, and while we have that project in that place, we add a bike lane or we add a sidewalk or a crossing. But we have some key gaps in the system where we may not have a project for a while. And if we increase investment within that, we can really start to address some of those strategic needs, which have exponential greenhouse gas benefits, equity benefits, and more. On the land use side, and I think this is another one where I paused for a minute and spent a little bit more time on, local greenhouse gas reduction planning. This is part of Every Mile Counts and is led by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. The LCD is launching a rulemaking process that will start next month, where they will change the transportation planning rule, and that's the rule that guides how city and county and NPO plans are done, and require that those plans address greenhouse gas emissions and try to achieve a greenhouse gas reduction target. There's targets set for each NPO. The process for this is still yet to be determined in terms of what the requirements are and how that planning looks. One version of it could look similar to Central Lane's scenario planning efforts in the past, which I was engaged in back in 2013, 14 time era, that would involve kind of a regional planning effort. The LCD's rulemaking, I think, recognizes that NPOs are federal entities, and therefore they cannot impose state requirement on those federal entities. So the rule is not likely to have a requirement specific to the Metropolitan Planning Organization. However, it is likely to encourage regional collaboration so that a city and county don't work alone, but work collaboratively together, through which an arrangement through the NPO or council of governments may make sense to do. So that rulemaking process, as I mentioned, is just starting and is set to kind of wrap up next fall. It'll be about a year process. Some other things that are going on relative to mitigation specific to ODOT. One thing that we're looking at is transitioning to lower carbon construction techniques, particularly looking at the fuels that we use within our construction equipment and looking at lower carbon materials. Eugene area is a champion of this and is a great model for us to follow, I think, on a statewide basis. So there's some good lessons we can learn there. We're working very closely with our contracting community because we want to first understand what are the emissions that we have today from these practices, and then what opportunities do we have, and then really develop the phased approach to that, especially recognizing that some of the firms have been hard hit by COVID, wildfires, and otherwise. The other thing that we're doing, performance measures, and this is really around accountability to the things that we do. So for the Every Mile Counts work and some of the actions I mentioned in the previous slide, there will be overall performance measures. So we'll look at performance measure for how are we doing relative to greenhouse gas reductions. So kind of tracking this chart longer term to see if hopefully we're bending that line back down, trying to get back on track. But also performance measures specific to individual activities. So for example, with electrification, we might be tracking how many charging stations we have in the state or percentage of gaps that are closed, how many registered electric vehicles there are, which will look different than performance measures to track the effectiveness of a trip reduction program. So there'll be some that are specific that way. So that's under development. We will have a dashboard website probably by middle of next year that will start to show some of this information at a pretty high level with the ability for folks to drill down. And then there's other implementation actions we know we need to pursue that we'll be looking at and investigating. I'll hit adaptation and sustainability very quickly. So adaptation, we're focused on three main vulnerabilities within the state: wildfires, extreme precipitation, and sea level rise. We've seen this in all parts of the state, so no part is immune to this. So the bottom right picture is flooding in Eastern Oregon that happened this spring. You can see impacting freight movement to erosion along the coast. This is Beverly Beach area where it's undercutting the state highway. to wildfires. This is a picture just a couple weeks ago on Highway 22 of what went on there. And then extreme precipitation that can blow out a culvert and cause the road to collapse and then be inoperable. So what we're doing relative to this is conducting a vulnerability assessment, understanding how these various things affect the transportation system, and then putting together a roadmap for adaptation and somewhat of a statewide strategy to say, here's how we're going to try to prepare the system, make it more resilient, recognizing that not everything we can prepare for. That some of it is just going to be plussing up our maintenance activities to clear debris out of the road or a landslide because it's too costly or unpredictable to address all those locations. And then lastly, sustainability, really around the idea of conserving energy. So some things that we're looking at, some things have a nexus with mitigation activities. So for example, we're looking at replacing our traffic lights, lighting, overhead lighting with LED lights, so to conserve energy and some of those kind of things. So that's also on the docket. And then this is my group, small but proud, of individuals working pretty hard on these issues. As I said, there's a link to the Every Mile Counts website, which is the collaboration among the 4 agencies, as well as the ODOT Climate Office website, which is currently being updated. So with that, I will stop presenting if I can figure out how to do it. There we go. And take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I see your hand up, Betty. I'll get to you in just a second. We are getting very limited in time at this point, so we'll allow about 7 to 10 minutes max on questions to get a little bit back on track. So go ahead, Betty.
Betty, we can't hear you.
Betty, can you hear us?
Yeah, you're still muted on your end somewhere.
Betty, you may have to go up to settings and change the sound. So the little settings dial at the top right corner of your screen, you may have to change that to the different microphone.
So while she's working on that, is there someone else have a question that we can get answered? Go ahead, Joe.
First, Amanda, that was great. Thank you very much. I have a question, and forgive my bias. I've worked in this field a bit. I heard you say in discussing multiple things, and it sounds like a lot of it relates to resources, right? How quick we can implement things. Is the state or any agency of the state in negotiations or exploring partnerships with multi-billion-dollar funds that want to get into the electric infrastructure space, are doing it? Okay, you know where I'm going with this, so I won't even waste our time. I'd love to hear what's going on with that. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, great question, Joe. So we are really partnering with charging companies that are coming in. Utilities certainly are seeing a market. What we're doing is kind of seeing what state agencies' niches too. So there's some areas of the state, and I think in particular rural areas or low-income areas, that may not pencil out to private developers coming in or utilities coming in and putting in the charging infrastructure. So we probably have more of a role to play there, at least in incentivizing that. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of others that we really leverage without using state funds.
If the need arises, and it may not, I have a good friend that manages a huge fund as it relates to that, and I would love to put you all in touch.
That would be perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And Betty, do you want to try your microphone again? Nothing.
Joe, I got a question. Do you want me to pipe in here?
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
Betty made me call in.
It depends on which Joe you're asking, Sean.
You're gonna say no. So I noticed that you had brought up freight, and is there some consideration being given for sort of understanding freight emissions into rural Oregon to make sure that we don't sort of overprice the ability to transport goods and services out into the rural area of the state?
Yeah, so freight's a tough one. Like I said, I think part of why we feel like it's tough to address emissions there is there's a lot of market driving factors, and we don't want to interfere with those. So I think what we're really trying to focus on is supporting the industry and where they want to go without necessarily, at least from ODOT's perspective, right? DEQ will be doing some regulations around things, and I'm sure they're sensitive to the issues they're bringing up. I'm just not quite sure how it will be addressed at this point.
So I would just continue to encourage you guys to make it in a business case proposition. All those guys understand fuel and emissions is an expense they have, right? And this is a place where your interests overlap. If they can do it more efficiently, they improve their margins. The second question I have is from a policy option perspective. Is there any consideration being given to the fact whether or not, because it sounds like in your presentation you need to turn everything to its maximum to get there, right? That whether or not some of these policy options have sort of decreasing returns associated to them, or is it always assumed that if we spend another $1 in bike ped, we're going to get the same reduction throughout the whole 40-year lifespan of the project?
There's certainly some, there's many that benefit more in an upfront cost than a longer term kind of investment strategy. So I think we are thoughtful about when and how we pursue certain things. Not everything will have the same return on investment. In fact, from project to project, it won't. So I think as we look at the STIP work that I talked about, it will be really over time refining and identifying more precisely some of the projects that have the biggest bang for our buck for GHG emissions. I think we know some general ones now that are effective, but a lot of it depends on the context within the project, and so we'll be flushing that out longer over time.
Okay, and my rapid fire round question before Joe kicks me off,
which is very cool.
In your presentation, you showed a graph that said when they included the plans, it said that we were on track to reduce our goals, but we were not on track to reduce GHG emissions to the point that the governor wants. Was that a fair assessment of that?
Yes, I apologize for any confusion in that graphic. So what that graphic shows is the state goal. So we are far off track from meeting the state goal. We expect to reduce emissions, but that emission reductions will be far short of where we need to be. And that's really, I think, where it takes that combination of state and city, county entities doing that together.
Thank you.
Caller 19 on the phone. We have feedback coming through your phone. If you could mute, please.
That is not a Gordon household.
So, that's not my end. I do have
No,
grandchildren.
it's caller 19. Hi, we have a caller on the phone. Could you please mute your phone? We can hear your background.
So I see Mayor Vinitz has got her hand up, and I assume you've communicated with Betty.
I have. So I'm going to ask Betty's questions, and then I'm hoping to ask my own if there's still time. So Betty is particularly wanting to know about trains and whether there's a potential for increased investment in train, both freight and passenger, incorporated in your greenhouse gas reduction thinking.
Great. So I think we definitely see a potential for trains to help reduce emissions for both goods movement and for people movement. So on the goods movement side, what we really need to focus on is there's some bottlenecks within the freight system. There's some areas where we know we need to increase the overall speeds. to really make it a more viable option. So I think it is trying to address some of those pinch points in order for it to be a more viable approach for people to ship their goods. And then on the passenger side, honestly, passenger freight is always a big challenge, particularly getting funding in from our state legislature to help support that. And in light of COVID, I think we've seen fewer riders recently. So I think it was a hard one to pursue anyway. That's gotten a little bit harder. Not that we're giving up on it, but just realistically, that's one of the more challenging areas for us to pursue.
Thank you. Can I just do a follow-up question of my own? So I am just wondering, you talked about congestion mitigation, particularly in the Portland area. I'm wondering if part of this, I actually have a two-part question, but part of this, would there be a consideration of, instead of certain kinds of highway expansion or adjustments, that would shift to more transit? So that's my first question. I have a second.
Okay. So at least it cut out a little bit on my end. What I think I heard you say is, how are we thinking about congestion projects? And is it always just addressing it from the road standpoint? Or are we really thinking multimodal? Is that fair?
Fair.
Okay. So I think some of our large projects, and so I hadn't heard the word Rose Quarter, but I'm sure that's on folks' minds. That's a legislative project. So we don't have a lot of control on exactly what that looks like, but I think some of our biggest levers are around increasing investments in public transportation, in demand management strategies, and in other approaches that really support a different way to think about transportation. It's not about vehicle capacity, it's about people movement capacity. So I think that's going to be a cultural shift that we're working on as an organization, that hopefully leads to some enhanced outcomes.
Right. And then the other piece, it really relates to the conversation we're about to have on our RTP, but I have a question about connectivity, because ODOT's looking at state highways. And so when we look at active transportation investment, you know, bikes and walking on state highways, not necessarily the best piece, but that connectivity to our local network could be pretty powerful. So I'm just wondering, as you look at that connection piece between how we're looking at the state system. I mean, in larger metropolitan areas, we don't have that many state highways running through our community anymore.
Right. So one of the hats I used to wear prior to being the director of the climate office was I managed the active transportation program for ODOT. So the question near and dear to my heart. So a couple of things. One, we've developed an active transportation needs inventory, and that really looks at where do we have the biggest gaps on our transportation system. But part of ranking those projects is identifying the connections to the local system and realizing that those are the critical routes to get to destinations. We tend to view on the state system active transportation as it's key as an avenue for access, but the bigger issue is making sure it's not a barrier. So often our focus will be more on crossing. So it's that connection to the local system. Again, it's the crossing in between. It's the maybe one block connection where there's not the parallel route that's a little bit more comfortable. So I think that's part of it. I would say the other big challenge is we have a shortage of active transportation funding within the state, and in particular for local jurisdictions. We used to have some grant programs available for the locals. Those have mostly gone away. We have very little funding at all for anything that's not on a roadway, whether that's a local or state system. So I think we have the biggest challenge I see right now is getting funding to support some of those pieces.
Okay, is that it for you, Mayor? All right. So is there any more questions? All right, so we are fairly behind now, and then thank you very much, Amanda, for your presentation. and we're going to go ahead and move on. And I wanted to just a brief comment that the next item is the RTP draft goals, and it's slated for 30 minutes, which would put us well past the meeting times, and other people have engagements. So, and I know that this particular topic has got a lot of interest, and I'm sure is going to generate a lot of questions. So I'm looking to Paul in regards to time management at this point. I did my best.
Thank you, Counselor. I can do a very quick presentation. We can certainly start the discussion on the RTP goals this month, and we can bring it back next month. That's the best I can offer. I'm also willing to stay here past 1:30.
I think there's, okay, Joe, go ahead. I have some commitments, but go ahead, Joe.
And all I wanted to say was I told staff and you, Chair, I needed to leave at 1.
Right.
This is going to be an important discussion. I'm going to be here as long as I can, make my position clear, and then I apologize, I have to leave.
So I want to make sure, this is a very important topic. I do want to make sure that everybody has opportunity to fully discuss this and to be comfortable with where we're going in this area and moving forward with this. So again, maybe we can go ahead and put out a presentation, give a chance for some folks to ask some questions or whatever, and then move this on and push this off to finish it up in a following their subsequent meeting. Is there do I have an agreement with the board, and I'm open for comments, but I think we need to make sure we get everything covered here and not leave people hanging.
I totally agree, Counselor.
Anybody in the board? Okay, so it looks as though I got some thumbs up. So let's go ahead and go with that, Paul, and give us a summary thing. We can get a little bit in a conversation going, and then I'd like to go ahead and adjourn this meeting on time.
Thank you, Counselor. Real quick, the presentation is only to recap what's in my cover memo. As part of developing the 2045 Long-Range Regional Transportation Plan, we have presented to you 7 draft goals that we believe as staff meet the federal requirements of the MPO's long-range plan. And we would like any comments or feedback on those 7 draft goals. But in particular, as has been noted, we then have also proposed to you 2 options for addressing greenhouse gas emissions within the long-range plan at this level. We understand that there's been a lot of interest from the public and a lot of discussion by this policy board. And so we're really looking for direction on whether to have a specific greenhouse gas emission goal as part of the draft RTP, and under that would have its own objectives, obviously. Or the second option presented is whether to include greenhouse gas emissions objectives under the other 7, 1 or more of the other 7 draft goals. There are ways that we can do that we believe would also be effective. I'm going to stop there in the interest of time. What I suggest today is that we try and get questions and initial comments to staff so that perhaps we can come back to you at the next meeting and pick up the discussion with some answers or some clarification if needed.
Thank you, Paul. And go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, I just want to kick this off right away. I know we need a longer discussion on it, but given the state presentation we just had about the metrics that they are gathering, and their focus on the GHG lens, I would think we'd want to be aligned with that. And it seems even if the state is not requiring it, we're going to need to be responsive to the state and be well positioned for state funding and aligning our goals with theirs. So I would advocate strongly for having an additional goal related to GHG emissions. I think one of the things we learned with the CAP 2.0 discussion in the was if you don't dial it in as a very specific goal and metric, it gets kind of lost in the larger context, and you really need to keep shining a light on it. So that would be my hope that this body would go in that direction.
Chair, this is Pete Sorensen. When you have a chance to call on me, I'd like to be in the queue.
I've got you in queue now, Peter, and I've got Carl Yeh, and then I'll call on you, Pete.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say I agree with Mayor Venus, and I want to stress that it is absolutely very possible to have a GHG goals. I just want, like, for Lane Transit District, we actually passed a resolution back in June where we actually set some very specific greenhouse gas emission goals, 75% reduction in emissions by 2030, for example, and changing our fleet to from fossil fuels to alternative fuels like electric. So I think these are all, I would love to see things like this incorporated. And I do think the public is in support of it and is making their voice heard to us too. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. And I have Pete Sorensen followed by Commissioner Burney.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to say that I do favor including a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. I think that's an important goal to be included in the RTP. And I think it's important that we have buy-in from the various jurisdictions. Lane County is just embarking on a climate action plan. We have an advisory committee. We have board direction to work on it. Staff is working on it, but we don't have much yet to say that we have any targets like Carl was just mentioning that's further ahead of us in terms of LTD. But I do think that in this, RTP, we really should be clear because of the statement earlier that 40% of emissions come from transportation, and that's what the MPC is in the business of doing, is facilitating transportation within the metro area with federal dollars. So that's why I think we should have that in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. And Commissioner Burney.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to preface by saying that LTD and no one else is ahead of anyone else. It's only on paper right now. But it's, my hat's off to that, to what Carl, you mentioned. But that is the problem. It's only on paper right now. So if we're just talking about a separate goal, may I suggest we be a little more brief? Reduce greenhouse gas emissions, period. We don't have to talk about that contribute to climate change. That's inherent in the statement. And it invites controversy where really there is none. The single greatest driver of new jobs and creating new markets and channels to those new markets is responding to the clean energy opportunity. So that, I just wanted to state that unequivocally. And if we're not going to vote now, Chair, I would love your permission to be excused.
Yes, please go, Joe. No.
Vote him off the island.
Sorry, I've always had a little bit of a flippant attitude. Joe, I really appreciate your input. We do, and your expertise. So you're free to go. We understand. So I do have. Thank you, Joe. I do have Councilor Van Gordon in queue, followed by Carl Yeh.
All right, thank you, Joe. Welcome, Petitionary. So I don't think, I don't think anybody's sort of discussing the impact and the ability and need to respond to overall to, greenhouse gas emissions. I think that the question is really how we leverage it in there. My preference actually would be to make it an objective, and I want to be careful as a board that we don't run too fast here, because there's state rulemaking that is going on that will impact all three jurisdictions right now, and it kind of reminds me of what we did in HB 2001, right? Springfield got a year ahead of the state on middle housing, and then the state rules came out, and then we wasted a year of sort of staff work that we could have been doing on something else. So I want to be sort of thoughtful here, and and kind of work our way to the most appropriate way to do it. I'm not necessarily opposed to having, if it's an objective, having a conversation around what if there needs to include a metric. Here's the concern that I have is I want to protect the jurisdiction's right to prioritize their transportation dollars. And ultimately, questions about sustainability and greenhouse gas emission reductions really need to happen at the local jurisdiction level. And that conversation should be as close to the people as possible. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. But like this conversation is going to go through a couple iterations. I understand that.
Thank you, Sean. And I'll go ahead and put myself, oh, I'm sorry, Carl, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I just want to, well, Joe Berning was still here. I just want to say that, you know, we actually are making progress in the sense that we've secured all the funding for electric buses. We actually have a few electrics already, and we're going to be adding more to them. We'll have those within a few years. And
I yield to Mr. Ye.
but I just want to point out, but I also agree with you, and I also agree with Sean. I think we're all talking about the same thing. I would like a little bit more of a specific metric, just because I think that would be a more concrete goal for us to try to achieve. But I think what we're really talking about is that we're trying to create opportunities for our local area and economy, and that this is definitely part of that too. So it's yes, it is about climate change, but it is also about making giving it proper incentives for people to make that change without well, there's going to be effort, but it'll be a driven effort for the right reasons.
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate that. And thank you, Sean. Do I hear of other comments from the other board members, commission members? I just want to comment too is that I reiterate what Councilor Van Gordon had stated, that I think I agree this is very important and I support it, but I think the method on how we're going to get there and making sure that all the interests are protected as well as possible. And I think, you know, everybody probably agrees with that. So I think I look forward to working this out. We're certainly going to have more discussion. I definitely am not in a position to make a decision today on this matter. I'm not. So with that, is there any comments in the chat from other folks that are not on camera view, or is there? Oh, I see Mayor Smith. Would you like to chime in, sir?
My concern has been voiced. I believe that if we try to get too specific right now, I just wonder what the state measurements or any other measurement for that matter that we would use to measure what we're going to do. And so I truly agree there needs to be a statement made that we are going to reduce greenhouse gases. But is this body going to go to the point of specifically listing, you know, land use, multimodal transportation, whatever may be, to get those things, and then find out that the state that we answer to is using different rulers for us to do that with? It's a statement that needs to be made, but I don't want to get into the weeds, I guess, and then find out that the flowers are way past the weeds and we missed them.
Thank you, Mayor Smith, and I see Mayor Venice with her hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we get the cart before the horse and be very specific here. I think what we're aiming for is to give some direction to our staff at LCOG about whether we want to include this broader goal. There are many, many steps between saying we're committed to, at some level, to highlighting this as a key goal for ours. We are many steps away, it seems to me, from identifying exactly how we would do that. And we will be continuing to get more information from the state about how they're doing it and what those metrics are. So I think this is really, at this moment, it's just to say, yes, this is the value we wanted in that list of goals. And we will have many conversations, much more information about what that actually looks like.
Well, I don't think you'd find many people disagreeing with you on that one. I see Betty Taylor's microphone is open. I don't know if you have a question or if you.
And if you wave at me, I'll call you.
Hey, Joe, can I ask a clarifying question so we make sure that we're all on the same page here?
Oh, please, Sean.
I think there's a discussion about, and Lucy, when you were just talking about goals briefly, like I think there's still a discussion about whether it's goals or objectives, but I mean, it sounded like you were meaning goals in the broader term of something we're trying to accomplish opposed to specifically on this list. Okay.
This is a list of goals. There's 7. We've been presented with 7 goals and offered the question about whether we want to add an 8th goal specifically around greenhouse gas emissions, or want to incorporate that into the existing 7. And difference would be that it's a standalone goal. So yes, in this larger umbrella of goals.
Yeah, and I think and maybe that's where we have to sort of hash it through the next meeting, because I think from a flexibility perspective or a jurisdiction perspective, I prefer that it be included in objectives, because if we executed these 7 goals, right, like one of the things that would reduce out of that is GHG emissions. Like, so I think maybe that's still an open question for all of us.
Yes, I agree, Sean. I think actual outcomes, measurable outcomes too, is an important element to that. So do I see any others in queue? Paul, do you see any in queue?
I do not, Counselor. If I may ask a quick question, or maybe 2 here. One is, would it be helpful as we pick this up next month to expand it all on the 2 options for greenhouse gas emissions in the memo for next month? In other words, we could present draft proposed language, not necessarily proposed, but draft example language of how a greenhouse gas emission goal might look if it was a standalone goal. And we could also present example objectives that would address that same topic if they were placed under the other objectives. I'm seeing thumbs up for that, so we will try and incorporate some of that for your next meeting.
That sounds like I've got some agreement. I'm okay with that. Lucy's nodding. Carl's got thumbs up. I heard from Sean, he's okay with it. Mayor Smith's good with it. So I think I don't think I hear of anybody disagreeing or anything like that. So sounds like a good plan, Paul.
Thank you. And then we will also bring back the other 7 draft goals, just so there's time to hear any feedback on those that we haven't had time for today.
Yes, please. And maybe when we, I'm just sensing that there's a lot of comments and recommendations, and people are pretty heartfelt about this particular topic. So let's make sure that we have an agenda build that's going to give us some good outcomes on those discussions. And are you getting my hint?
Thank you. Again, we will bring this back. We will give it a sufficient time, perhaps at the start of next month's agenda. I think it can have quite a bit of time on the agenda as far as I know now. So again, thank you for your input today.
Yeah, sounds great, Paul. Yeah, thank you. And you could potentially build the agenda to where if there's an item at the bottom end of it that can drop off and be pushed back without too much angst, that'd be fine too, in case we do get done a little bit sooner than anticipated.
Will do.
All right. Everyone else looking good? Okay, so we finished 4 minutes ahead of time, and I'm okay with that. I'm trying to keep Betty happy because her and I know that's an important thing. So everyone, have yourselves a wonderful day. Be safe and take care. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.